One of the premises of this course is that you can think better, that you can cultivate thinking, and that you can improve thinking. That does not mean absorbing more information or memorizing more information, but it means improving the process of how you think. We see this idea emerge in Western culture with Socrates in ancient Athens 2,500 years ago. It seems that Socrates developed a method of using questions to think better. He said he wasn't an expert, just a person who asks experts questions. So, for example, Socrates would talk to a soldier and ask the soldier to define bravery. The soldier would think it was easy to define bravery because he was a soldier. He's an expert in bravery. So the soldier would say something like to Socrates, bravery is being able to stand your ground when you're being threatened. Then Socrates would ask another question. So if a pig stands his ground, is a pig brave like a man? Or if a person stands his ground because he doesn't understand the danger, is that bravery? Or if a person is reckless, is that bravery? And this discussion with Socrates would go on, and the person would get frustrated and say at the end, I know what bravery is, I just can't define it. Well, Socrates was not teaching how to define terms, he was teaching how to reason. And that process of reasoning through questions is called elenchus in Greek. Now, we did that last week in class. I did elenchus, this 2,500-year-old word technique from Socrates. I did it last week in class when I asked, why is cheating on a test wrong? Or why is stealing wrong? Or why is lying wrong? And Tegan got caught up in the elenchus of doing that on behalf of the class. We know that it is wrong, but to explain why it is wrong is more difficult. So we're examining the process of critical thinking, and the premise is that critical thinking can be improved. We learn a process to improve critical thinking. We do that now when we ask, what is the evidence? Does the evidence support the claim statement? How does the evidence support the claim statement? Or we're doing critical thinking when we ask, what is the warrant here? What is the missing assumption? So that's critical thinking, and we're developing a process of, or examining a process of critical thinking in this class. So far, so good. But now we get to the question of, can we listen better and can we read better? Is reading and listening like breathing? You just do it naturally? Or do some people listen better and read better than others? And if some people read better and listen better than others, why? Can you improve the way you listen? Can you improve the way you read? The assignment due a week Friday is about how you read the course text. How do you read the text, and can you read the text better? How do you listen, and can you listen better? Are listening and reading similar or different? You can memorize the text. Well, that would be an incredible feat. I've run across a few people who can do that. But if you can memorize the text, does that mean you have learned the text? For example, a parrot can repeat words, but a parrot does not understand what the words mean, and the parrot is not using words to communicate. So I think you would agree with me that a parrot does not understand what a parrot can repeat. Memorizing is not knowing. Memorizing is not learning. So what about reading and listening? What is reading? What is listening? When you talk to people, do you sometimes have the sense that they are not listening to you? sometimes my wife says to me, "You're not listening to me." And I answer as a good husband by repeating word for word what she says. This always amazes my wife because she thinks I'm not listening. So there are two aspects of that. What's involved in listening. One is eye contact, and one is multitasking. We assume that somebody is listening when they are watching us, and we assume that somebody can't listen and do another task at the same time. For example, can you drive a car and listen at the same time? Some of you might say yes, but can you talk and drive a car at the same time? In my case, not always. Sometimes I miss an exit or I miss a turn when I'm driving and talking to my wife, and I suddenly wake up and say, well, it's not as though I was asleep, but I do. There's an absence of focus there, and suddenly I stop talking and I realize I'm not where I want to be. So maybe we can multitask in some situations, and in other situations, we can't multitask. What about eye contact in terms of listening and thinking? Can we tell whether someone is listening by observing their eyes? And can we tell when someone is lost in thought by their eyes? Yes, that is something that we have learned as human beings. We control where we look. If you stare at a stranger, you attract attention. In some cultures, staring at a stranger is considered very aggressive, and it can get you into trouble. If you stare at something, you are thinking about something. We know that. And that is something that orangutans also know. Orangutans know that when you are looking at something, you are thinking about something, and there's a reason why you are thinking about that something. The orangutan then asks himself or herself, what could you be thinking about? And this shows the ability to reflect, and orangutans can reflect. I know all this because I traveled the world interviewing scientists and zookeepers about orangutans, and then I wrote a book about what I learned. So orangutans know that when you stare at something, you are thinking about something, and there's a reason why you are thinking about that thing. So if you stare at another orangutan, you are thinking about that orangutan. And staring at another orangutan might be unwise because it might be taken as a signal of aggression or contemplating aggression, depending on the quality of the stare. And the way we stare can be different. So you're an orangutan, and if you stare at a fruit tree in the jungle, you are thinking about that fruit tree. Maybe you have observed that the fruit is ripe and you want to eat the fruit, but if you stare at the fruit tree, then other orangutans will know that the fruit is ripe and they will eat the fruit. So what does an orangutan do? The orangutan looks in another direction and doesn't stare at the fruit tree. It knows enough to not signal what it is thinking about. The orangutan waits until the other orangutans wander off, and then it eats the fruit. So an orangutan knows how to deceive others about what it is thinking by not looking at what it is thinking about. A scientist told me one time about an orangutan I know called Princess. In the late 1960s, Princess was taught sign language but in an experiment by a friend of mine to prove that orangutans can learn to communicate with sign language. Princess didn't just memorize sign language. She created new concepts by combining words in original ways. Years later, a scientist told me that Princess was wandering around a research camp in the jungle of Borneo, and she spotted a rip in the screen of a window in the cabin of a staff member. Princess wanted to go inside the cabin to search for food, but there were humans around and they would see her and go inside and stop her. So she didn't look at the tear, because then the humans would follow her gaze and see what she intended to do. So to deceive the human beings, she spent hours outside looking in other directions and pretending that she wasn't interested in the rip in the screen. Finally, the human beings left. Princess went inside the cabin and was later found inside the cabin eating mangoes. I had a similar experience myself. One time I spent a month inside a sanctuary for orphan orangutans in Borneo. By that time, I knew that orangutans would deceive you by what they were thinking about, by where they were looking. And you can sense that. You can sense that someone is avoiding looking at you. You know when somebody is staring at you, but you can also sense when somebody is avoiding looking at you, which means they're thinking about you, but want to hide that they are thinking about you. So I was sitting on the grass in this orangutan sanctuary, watching young orangutans play, and I sensed that one orangutan was thinking about me, but pretending that he was not thinking about me. He was playing and moving in a zigzag pattern. First, he would zig to the right, then he would zag to the left. But I noticed there was a pattern. Every time he zigged and zagged, he was getting closer and closer to me while pretending that he wasn't thinking about me and that he wasn't moving towards me. Eventually, one of the staff saw that what he was doing and yelled at him, and he understood that he had to stop. He didn't need words to tell him to stop because he knew what he was thinking about. And when he heard the tone and the voice of the staff member in Indonesian, which neither I nor the orangutan understand, he knew it was connected with what he was thinking about, and he had to stop that. So watching can be thinking, just as listening can be thinking and reading can be thinking. And that's the essential distinction I want to make between these things. Watching, listening, and reading can be thinking. When you listen, you could be memorizing what you hear without understanding it, like a voice recorder, or you could be thinking about what you are hearing. So for instance, suppose you are listening to a lecture and taking notes. When you take notes, do you only record what is being said, or do you write down questions that arise from what you hear? That's a distinction that has to do between recording and thinking. Or when you read, that is when you read the course textbook, are you hoping to remember everything you read, or are you underlining passages? Are you writing notes in the margin? Are you writing down questions that arise from what you read? The distinction there is whether when you read, you're just doing a mechanical type of recording into your memory, or whether you're engaging in thinking when you're reading. And what indicates and what process is there if you're thinking while you're listening? And what process is there if you're thinking while you're reading? So by this point, you want to be asking yourself, when you're listening to a lecture, are you just doing some superficial exercise in memorizing or hoping you're going to memorize it? Or are you thinking about the lecture? Are you thinking about what you're reading? And how do you know what level of thinking you're at when you're listening or when you're reading? Years ago, I was writing a PhD thesis on the mystic romantic poet William Blake, and I wanted to know what Blake was thinking when he was reading. And a typical way of gauging this is what's called marginalia, which is writing notes in a margin. So if you're doing research in literary criticism, a primary source might be the books that a writer or a thinker has. And you go to those books that the writer or thinker once owned, and you look for the marginalia. The marginalia are what a person who owns the book writes in the margin because they're thinking about what they're writing. Thus, marginalia is evidence of what somebody is thinking, and then it's important evidence in literary criticism. So when I was writing a PhD on the mystic poet William Blake, I went all the way to California to a private book collection that had collected the books in the personal library of William Blake. And in the margin, Blake wrote comments, and the comments showed me what Blake was thinking while he was reading. So this was primary evidence that I could draw on. I didn't have to guess what Blake was thinking. I could go to the marginalia. So with this next assignment coming up, one way to mark the assignment would be for me to ask everybody in the class for the notes you made while you're reading the text and the conversation you had between yourself and the text. And I would be looking for evidence of you thinking about the text. I would look at what did you underline? Why did you underline that? What notes did you make in the margin? What questions did you write down to explore further? What terms in the text did you write down and explore later on the internet? What agreements or disagreements did you write down with the text? That would be all evidence of what you were thinking and how deeply you were thinking about the text while you're reading it. So imagine if that was the assignment for you to deliver your reading notes for marking. Would you be panicking right now thinking, oh my gosh, I don't have any reading notes from the text. I didn't write down any questions. I didn't write down any terms. Or do you think, oh, that's easy. I did that, and that's going to make the assignment easily. Have you ever been marked for how you listen and how you read? Well, that's this next assignment, and I'm not going to ask you to submit your reading notes, and I'm going to simply ask you for this assignment, so you have more time to think about it. So that takes us to the issue, how do you take notes? How do you take notes? And how can taking notes be a process of thinking? So when we ask questions or when we answer a question, then we are thinking, not memorizing. And that was part of why I brought Socrates into this and the process of elenchus, because what Socrates was creating was not a process of one person lecturing to another person, which is typical in universities. Socrates was trying to create a process of thinking through questioning. So this leads us to the conclusion, observation, that when we ask questions or when we answer a question, then we are thinking, not memorizing. And a better question can lead to better thinking, which was going to be the topic of my lectures in the second last week of the course. And it's the topic in chapters 3 and 4 of the course text. And in the winter term, I'm actually teaching a course just on asking questions as a way to improve thinking and improve knowledge. And that is a unique course because so much of an education at university is focused on learning what is known rather than asking questions to get knowledge or asking questions about what is known. That's a journalism course, but it's open to anybody, and it applies to more disciplines than just journalism. Asking questions is a skill to get information. This cohort is a cohort in police and justice studies, and you've told me a majority of you are thinking of a career in law enforcement or the RCMP, and you can't be a police officer without asking questions. So that course is open, and anybody can take it. Part of the purpose of my lectures is to help you read the textbook in a more focused way. So my last session was on chapter 11, not so that you don't have to read chapter 11, but you can read the chapter in a more focused way. I teach journalism students how to listen better. And what does that mean? Well, in the beginning, journalism students don't know what to record in their notes. I take my journalism students to a meeting of city council or to a court case, and the first task is to write notes of what they hear and then go back to the lab and use those notes as the basis for writing a story. So some of these students will take notes of everything that is said because they don't know what they should record and what they don't need to record. And that means they're being inefficient. When they come to write a story, they'll have too many notes, and too many notes is chaotic, and it slows down the process of writing a story. So these students aren't thinking about what to take notes of. They don't know what to take notes of and what not to take notes of. Some students just take a voice recorder to a city council meeting or a court case. Actually, you're not allowed to take a voice recorder in a court case. Here in Kamloops, you have to get special permission as a reporter, but maybe somebody will do it surreptitiously. Anyway, it's the same situation. If you could voice record a court case and listen to it later, that would be inefficient, because when it's time to write a story from notes, the student is confused and doesn't know what to write about. The student has to write a story from the voice recording and now has to listen to the voice recording and take notes from the voice recording, and that eats up the time. Other students don't take enough notes. When it's time to write a story from their notes, they're confused and they say they don't know what to write about, and they don't have enough information to write a story. Finally, there will be students who take just enough notes, not too many notes and not too little notes, just the right number of notes. That's a kind of Goldilocks principle. Not too hot, not too cold, but just right. So I've given you an example of different types of students taking notes. Students who take too many notes, students who take too few notes, and students who take just the right amount of notes. So in order to teach students how to take notes, journalism students, I have to teach them how to recognize what is essential and what is not essential in journalism. And the same would be true for this cohort in police and justice studies. You would know officers carry little notebooks like journalists, and they know what is essential to record and what is not essential to record. My other cohort is in respiratory therapy, and they would do the same thing. In their discipline, they need to ask questions of a patient, and they know what are essential questions and what not essential questions. So for my journalism students, I help them create filters for what to listen to and what to record in their notes, which is also learning what not to record in the notes. For example, I give the students a news principle, and the principle is what information has the most impact on the most people, and thus has the most interest for their audience. So that becomes a filter for the journalism students of what it is essential for them to record and what is not essential for them to record. So, for example, suppose the city council is discussing two issues. One issue is whether to attend a boring municipal conference, and the other issue is to raise the tax rate. Raising the tax rate has the most impact on the most people, so the student should focus on that issue and take notes on that issue. I tell the students to prepare their filter before the meeting by reading the council agenda and forming a working hypothesis of what will be the issue at the meeting with the most impact and the most people. So now the students are prepared to listen more intently to that issue, and they're prepared to take notes of that discussion. They are thinking and filtering more what to listen to and what to take notes of. So that's similar to your next assignment. You are asked, the assignment is basically to show how you are thinking about what you are reading. The assignment asks you to identify 5 specific and different essential principles in the course text. So your first task and your most important task and your crucial task is to define what essential means and what a principle means. If I do that work for you, if I do that thinking for you, if I define what is essential in the text and what a principle means, you can memorize that, but I am doing the thinking for you. And in this assignment, you have to do the thinking for yourself. It is like if I gave you a shopping list and all you had to do was go to the grocery store and pick up those items. If I said it is essential that you pick up oranges at the grocery store, all you have to do is find the oranges. You aren't learning about shopping. You aren't learning about thinking. You aren't learning about reading. So to do the assignment, you have to develop a really good definition of what essential means. In this case, a simple dictionary definition will not be good enough. The textbook in chapter 5 warns about using simple dictionary definitions, particularly from online tertiary sources. Scholarly and professional reference manuals are better than ordinary dictionaries, and you have to understand what the text is teaching, what is most important in what the text is teaching, and you have to explain why that is most important. For example, take the definition of the word democracy. The definition was essential in the last assignment in the option, if you chose the option, whether fake news is a threat to democracy. In order to understand democracy, you have to understand what a democracy is and how a threat could affect a democracy. A good definition would be a democracy is a political system in which the power to make decisions and to take actions is decided by citizens who either make direct decisions such as referendums or elect politicians to make decisions in their interest. So, as I said in the past in terms of critical thinking, identifying definitions is a crucial preliminary step. And in that assignment, you needed a really good definition of democracy in order to understand what could threaten that. The definition that I've just given is a general definition, and you can go even farther because not all democracies are the same. Democracies are different. A more specific definition of democracy would look at different voting systems and who can be a voter. So in the Philippines, where my wife is from, people vote directly for the president of the Philippines. That is direct democracy, like in ancient Athens. We don't have that direct democracy in Canada or in the United States. In Canada, there is no direct vote to elect a prime minister. Instead, people vote for their local federal candidate. The political party that wins the most seats in the country in Canada forms the government, and whoever is head of the party becomes the prime minister. So the head of the party is elected by members of the party, not by voters in Canada. And so you see what happens then in Canada. It's not the voter who directly elects the prime minister like the people of the Philippines elect the president. In the United States, there's a modified type of direct vote for the president called the Electoral College system. And that's a winner-take-all system, which we don't have in Canada. The people vote in each state for the president they want. Each state has a set number of Electoral College votes. Whatever candidate gets the most votes in a state gets all the Electoral College votes. So if there are 100 Electoral College votes in one state and one candidate gets 51% of the vote, that candidate gets all 100 Electoral College votes. Now, I've just given you three specific versions of democracy and the system of voting, because they all entail differences in how a vote can be affected by fake news. So this means that fake news can affect a democracy differently depending on the system of voting. In the Philippines, with a direct vote for the president, fake news could affect individual voters by persuading them to change their votes. In Canada, however, where people vote for a local candidate and not for the prime minister directly, fake news about a prime minister candidate might not affect the local vote. People might not like a candidate like Justin Trudeau, but still vote for the local candidate. And if a large number of Canadian voters just vote for a Liberal candidate, they essentially are putting Trudeau into power, even though they don't vote for him directly, and the fake news might not affect who they vote for locally. Thus, a fake news and campaign in Canada that focused on the head of a political party might not change the vote in election. It would be a weak hypothesis that that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in danger of not getting elected because of fake news, because that's not likely to happen in the system we have. Liberal candidates are elected locally, and the prime minister is not elected directly. In the US, with the Electoral College system, the fake news could lower the popular vote for a candidate. And so somebody might argue that fake news lowered the popular vote for a presidential candidate, but that's irrelevant to how the system works. Because if fake news lowers the popular vote for a presidential candidate, the candidate can still win in a winner-take-all system. So in the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by 2.9 million total popular votes. But she lost under the Electoral College system. Clinton beat Trump by the popular vote. Trump lost the popular vote, but Trump still won as president in 2016. So proving that fake news changed the popular vote in the United States is not proof that fake news changed the election. In the Philippines, it would be much easier to prove that fake news changed the election than in Canada and the United States. So I've gone through a complex example there to demonstrate how important definitions are, how important a precise definition is in critical thinking, and how important it is in the assignment. So in the next assignment, you start by defining what is most essential in the text, why it is most essential, and what the warrants are in your definition. And I've spent a whole session on warrants, and there's a whole chapter on that in the text. And you now understand that in a definition, you could have some missing assumptions, you could have some warrants. So you want to make sure your definition is complete and has all the warrants. And that's why I just went through a complicated process of talking about what a democracy is and how a democracy is different in the Philippines, Canada, and the United States because of the voting system, and those definitions and those making clear those warrants and missing assumptions help us to evaluate in what sense fake news could affect a democracy and what kind of evidence we need. So your next assignment, you have to define what essential means in the text. Defining what is essential lays the foundation for the assignment. If the definition of essential is weak, the foundation is weak. If the definition of essential is strong, the foundation in the assignment is strong. Now, what is essential can change depending on the specific context. So you have to define the context too in what makes something essential. For example, what is essential to learning a new language is different from what is essential to baking a cake. So the definition of essential has to be more precise, has to deal with assumptions and warrants, and it has to be specific to what the text is about. A too general definition of what is essential won't be as good for you in doing the assignment as a more precise definition of what is essential. Part of that, getting the context of what is essential in the textbook, is understanding the purpose of the course textbook. How is the purpose of the course textbook related to what is essential? So you might want to look at what the purpose of the text is. So for example, the purpose of a car is transportation. So we might not argue that it is essential that a car have a good radio system. It is nice if a car has a good radio system, but it is not essential that a car has a good radio system, because what's essential is the purpose of a car. The purpose is transportation. Once you have defined essential in the context and purpose of the text, you give 5 different examples that fit that definition of being essential. The examples must be different, not similar. That's precise wording in the assignment. Different examples, not similar examples. And the examples should be scattered through the text. If you find 5 similar examples, those aren't different, and you are doing less thinking. You're doing more thinking if you can find 5 different examples than 5 similar examples. If you find and when you do the assignment, you need to put in the page reference, as with any assignment. So if you find 5 examples within 10 pages, it is obvious that you didn't read the whole text, and you're hoping that there are parts of the text that aren't more essential. You're just guessing. You're trying to do the assignment quickly and game the assignment, and so you flip to 10 pages, or you flip to one chapter and base the assignment on that. You should show originality and thinking in your choices, not simply repeat the lectures. The ability to repeat the lectures does not show thinking, but the ability to apply the lectures or apply the text to new situations does show thinking. The course outline made this assignment easy for you because it instructed you from the beginning to take notes as you read the text and take notes as you did the assignments on what surprised you and helped you the most. That way, at this point, you've already done most of the assignment. You just assemble your notes. If you didn't follow those instructions, now you have more work, but you can still do it. The next question is, how did you take notes of the text in this course or in any course? What are the principles of selection for you in taking notes? How do you identify what is essential to note and what is not essential to note? What questions did you write down by reading the text? Remember I said that marginalia, writing notes, writing questions in the text shows thinking while you're reading. It shows engagement and conversation with the text. Did you dispute anything in a chapter? Write that down in a note and then see later if you could resolve that question. Examples help you to understand principles, but examples are not principles and examples are not definitions. Never give an example without stating first a principle or a definition. Give the principle first or give the definition first, then give an example to help your reader understand the principle or the definition. Some people just give an example instead of a principle and definition, and then they have not given a total explanation, and then they may lose their reader. That's when people use the word when as though defining a term. For example, somebody might say, gravity is when an object falls to the ground. That is an example of gravity, but not a definition of gravity. Before you give the reader the example of gravity, you want to give the definition of gravity. So you would say something like, gravity is a force between objects of mass that attracts the object of a smaller mass to the object of larger mass, such as when an object falls to the ground. That's a good form of communication. The principle first, then the example. The two work well when you put them together. They don't work well when you just give one. When you just give a principle without an example, or an example without a principle. And so you want to incorporate that into your process of communication. There's a skill in finding examples that illustrate a principle in a very clear and original way. A principle is an abstract idea. An example is a concrete, particular form of the abstract. If you want to get a higher mark in the assignment, you would be able to identify 5 essential different principles in the text. And maybe there's examples of those in the text, but you would do better if you identify the principle in the text and then find an original example outside the text where it requires more thinking on your part. So, to summarize, taking notes and listening requires principles of what is essential to know. Listening requires principles of what is essential to know. Reading the text requires principles of what is essential to know. A principle by itself may be so abstract it is hard to understand. An example by itself may be so specific it is hard to understand how it is relevant. A principle stated in a few words is easy to remember. A graphic example is memorable. Together, the principle or definition plus the example work well in communication. And if you look at the text, that's what the text does. The text states abstract principles and gives examples. That is how the text communicates. The text is modeling good communication by the simple principle of give a principle, then example. The premise here is that reading the text is not simply recording in your mind what is written, but understanding and evaluating. In other words, reading should be thinking. Listening should be thinking. If you are not thinking when you read, are you actually reading? If you're not thinking when you're listening, are you actually listening? And that's why I disagree with Mendoza says that students learn better when a professor gives them lecture notes. If taking notes involve thinking, then how can you learn more with less thinking? It all depends on the warrant, whether or not taking notes involves thinking. If it doesn't involve thinking, Mendoza is right. If it does involve thinking, then Mendoza is wrong. Developing thinking is learning to use principles of critical thinking, such as identifying missing assumptions or warrants, or being able to identify what is evidence and when the evidence supports the claim statement or the thesis statement. Critical thinking is useful in listening. Critical thinking is useful in reading. And so those are our intellectual tools this course has emphasized, and intellectual tools can improve your listening and can improve your thinking. So just as there is critical thinking, there's critical listening, and there's critical reading. Sometimes it's called active listening, but it's basically critical listening and critical thinking. And we can take the principles of critical thinking and apply them to listening and reading. So you remember early on in this course, I gave you an easy 4-part test for critical thinking. First was, what are the assumptions, premises, and warrants? Are the assumptions explicit or implicit? Second, what are the definitions? Third, what are the evidence and facts, and do the evidence and facts support the claims? And fourth, what are implications? What are the implications and consequences? Are the implications and consequences explicit or are they implicit? Let me give you one last example and end with this example of an assignment that I've given in the past where a crucial aspect was the definition. So in the past, I've done an assignment where students had to evaluate whether the food on campus is in the best interests of the students. To do the assignment, the students had to define what is in the best interests of students in food on campus. This was in business communication classes, and most of the students defined best interest as either cost or convenience or wait time or variety or specialized food, specialized ethnic food. Very few students defined best interest as nutrition. Very few students had a criteria or definition of best interest. They simply assumed that their choice was self-evident. Nobody would disagree with that. It didn't need an explanation. The warrant wasn't necessary. So the warrants weren't stated. Some students didn't distinguish between interest and best interest. And that's comparable in your assignment to essential, okay? So some students did distinguish between interest and best interest. convenience of food may be good, but why is convenience better than other elements? Why is convenient best? To justify best, the students needed a warrant for best. And it was puzzling, or maybe it wasn't puzzling, why so many business students ignored nutrition as in the best interest of students and thought that the most important elements are cost and convenience. The value of these students was that they would rather have poor nutrition if it costs them less and is quick to get. And some of them would rather pay more for the convenience of paying a higher price for food on campus than packing a lunch or going to the deli at the grocery store just off campus. But if I had nursing students in the class, the nursing students chose nutrition as what is in the best interest of students. So the problem in that assignment was the same problem you begin your next assignment with, is defining what is most essential. Many of the students of these business students assumed that what is best interest meant what they assumed it meant and skipped the stage of defining the term and examining the warrants in the term. So I think you see from that terribly long-winded session and maybe more abstract than you'd wish for, that in the assignment, it's crucial that you define what is essential in the text, and you explain why it's essential in detail.